Desert Immigrants by Mario T. Garcia. Chapter 6, The Mexican Schools. Important mainly as an unskilled labor force, Mexicans in El Paso and throughout the Southwest received only a minimal education through Mexican schools located in the barrios. Education along the border, as elsewhere, serviced with the specific economic and intellectual needs of the larger community. In El Paso, the type of training provided Mexicans by racially segregated public schools complemented the labor requirements of industries and businesses for manual workers from the Mexican population. The schools also functioned as a means of social control through their attempts to Americanize the Mexicans in order to make them loyal and disciplined. Future employees limited in schooling. Mexican immigrants and their children did not have access to educational opportunities that would permit them to close the economic gap between themselves and most Americans. From their inception, El Paso's public schools segregated most Mexican children. When the first schools opened in 1883, it appears that only a few Spanish-speaking children attended. Despite a school census reporting 116 Mexicans of school age, while poverty and migratory habits adversely affected their enrollment, Mexicans also faced a language barrier. The school board refused to teach any child who did not know English. Consequently, only a small number of Mexicans studied in the early schools. To alleviate this condition, some concerned parents supported the efforts of Olivius V. Oye, an elderly Spaniard who in 1887 began teaching English to Mexican children. In order to prepare them for the entrance into the public schools, commencing with 29 pupils, Oye could barely meet his expenses with the small tuition he charged. As a result, the school board 1 year later voted to incorporate Oye's school into the public system, but on a segregated basis. Faced with a growing Mexican school-age population with future economics and social consequences for El Paso, the school board believed that whose school became known as the Mexican Preparatory School, could provide a useful service. The school board, unwilling and unprepared to teach English to Mexican children in the regular schools, hired Aoy to perform that function. Mexican students would first learn English under Aoy, and when adequately prepared, could transfer to another school. By the early 1890s, Aoy, with 2 Mexican assistants, was instructing almost 100 students in their first and second grades. Unfortunately, and to the sorrow of many Mexican parents and children, Aoy died in 1895. The superintendent of the public schools, however, pledged that the Mexican schools would continue and urged every child who had attended Oye's school to contribute flowers to the Spaniard's grave in honor of the teacher who has labored so earnestly for the Mexican children of the city. Following Aoy's death, the school board appointed W.H.T. Lopez, principal of the Mexican Preparatory School, whose enrollment continued to soar as more immigrants arrived in El Paso. In 1897, the Southside School had 200 pupils but only 3 teachers. To relieve overcrowded conditions, the school board authorized construction of a new 6-room building named after Oye that would accommodate 300 students. Yet in its decision, the board stressed that its policy remained to segregate Mexicans at least through the 4th grade before transferring them to American schools. At the same time, the board emphasized that due to the cost of maintaining the Mexican school it could provide, Oye only with the first 4 grades The new school regrettably quickly became congested. At the turn of the century, 500 Mexicans studied in double sessions at AOI, which had the highest enrollment of any El Paso school. Ironically, it graduated few Mexicans to other public schools with higher grades since. Despite a new knowledge of English, most Mexican children had to seek work after the early grades to augment the family income. Hence, a distinct pattern of school segregation and educational underdevelopment for Mexicans became accepted in El Paso's school system. On the eve of the great period of immigration from south of the border, during the next 30 years, more Mexicans would attend schools, but still apart from American children and in overcrowded and inferior facilities. Although most Mexican students after 1900 left school between the 4th and 6th grades to find work to augment the family income, school officials argued that because of the need for Mexican children to work at an early age, the Mexican schools should direct their attention to manual and domestic education that would best assist the students to find jobs. On the other hand, the schools in American neighborhoods presented a better rounded curriculum with both practical and academic training. In his report to the school board in 1908, School Superintendent F.M. Martin stressed the difference between Mexican and American schools. The problem of the Mexican children, Martin stated, had to be considered separate from that of American children. He believed that the best manual training should be introduced to American elementary students, including cardboard construction, clay modeling, sand, table work, weaving, and other activities emphasizing individual initiative, as well as laying the foundation for advanced academic work. However, according to Martin, even this type of non-academic training would not be possible for Mexican students. The superintendent admitted that such a curriculum might be taught in the Mexican schools if the students completed the grammar grades. Yet almost all the Mexicans left school by the 6th grade. Martin concluded that the most that could be expected of the average Mexican child whose parents could not afford more than 4 years of education would be for the child to become fairly proficient in English and to be able to solve simple arithmetical problems, such as those he would face in everyday life. Consequently, Martin advised that teachers in the Mexican schools concentrate on the practical side of education and that the supervisor of manual training be instructed to devise proper means by which to direct the activities and latent energies of the Mexican children into channels which will lead them in after life to be more useful and incidentally to become happier in the exercise of these God-given facilities. To the superintendent, sewing represented one activity that he believed worthwhile for Mexican children. Martin's assessment of the Mexican's child educational potential became the accepted belief that of many other Americans in El Paso. The Times in 1909, for example, stated that the large Mexican population posed a peculiar problem, end quote, for the city's schools. This consisted of the fact that public schools taught 1,800 Mexicans, most of whom knew little English and who remained in school for no more than 4 years before they had to leave and find work. The great question, unquote, stressed the Times, is how to accomplish the greatest good for these children in the short time that they remain in school. The solution, it believed, involved the school board's curriculum for the Mexican schools, which covered elementary manual training, habits of truthfulness and honesty, reading, writing, and speaking English, and some arithmetic. Such a course of study, the Times, excuse me, this book keeps shifting. The Times reasoned would meet with the particular needs and capacities of the Mexican students. And it is the purpose of our system to lift up these children to higher ideals and to better living, to the end that they may be happy themselves and more useful to the city in which they live. The Women's Civic Improvement League expressed not only the view of the limited mental capacities of the Mexicans, but also the benefits for some Americans to be derived from manual training in the Mexican schools. The League noted that in the public schools, 2,000 Mexican children learned English and other practical skills, such as reading and writing. In addition, it observed that the schools instructed them in morals, cleanliness, and truthfulness. The League believed, however, that more advanced instruction could be provided for older Mexican students. A well-equipped manual training school for these pupils, it suggested that it would benefit the entire community. According to the League, the house girls for the entire city came from the Mexican settlement, and if they could be taught housekeeping, cooking, and sewing, every American family would benefit. The Mexican girls would likewise profit from, since their services would improve and hence be in greater demand. These children are particularly apt in whatever they can do with their hands, unquote. The League emphasized they write well and draw well and naturally take to finger work, sewing, weaving, etc. The League proposed that if a significant number of Mexicans could be taught English, domestic science, and manual training, El Paso would solve a major economic problem by adding to the productivity of its Mexican population. Commissioned by the school board to survey the city schools. Sorry, this page is sticking. Sorry about that. Paul W.H. Horn, the superintendent of American schools in Mexico City, further recommended in 1922 vocationally oriented education for El Paso's Mexican children. Horn believed that besides English, the Mexican children should receive instruction in those activities in which he or she was especially gifted. These included music and handiwork. Horn also advocated for the Mexican, quote, training of an industrial nature especially suited to his needs and capacities. As an example, the American educators stressed that the special provisions could be made to teach cooking and sewing in the first 3 grades. The Mexican schools, since unlike in American districts, Mexican girls of 13 and 14 could be found in these grades. Horn believed that such vocational subjects would meet the most important curriculum needs of the Mexican schools. After these subjects are taught, his report concluded it will not make so much difference if less emphasis is placed upon the other subjects of the conventional elementary school curriculum. As a result of such views, the Mexican schools pursued a curriculum emphasizing the need to train Mexicans on simple skills and to socialize them to American norms and values. Wood shops, sewing rooms, laundry rooms, and domestic science rooms became regular settings for a Mexican student's training. Despite the stress on manual training, however, the Southside schools did not receive much financial support for this aspect of their curriculum, as did the American schools. Hoy, for example, received only $125.50 a month in 1910 for manual training expenses compared to Lamar in the American North Side, which obtained $340.90. Clearly, although manual training played a major role in the Mexican schools, it was intended to teach only limited skills for children who would fill jobs as laborers, servants, and laundresses. The Mexicans' educational experience in El Paso was not, of course, unique. Similar stress on vocational education existed on other southwestern areas, as it did indeed throughout the United States, especially in urban areas with high concentration of industrial workers. Both native born and foreign born. In 1911, J.C. Ross, writing in the New Mexico Journal of Education, recommended industrial education for Spanish-speaking population of New Mexico. Not only would this form of education provide Mexicans with a trade, but also, according to Ross, would teach the intrinsic value of all work. Pearl I. Ellis, in her Americanization through Homemaking, emphasized in the 1920s that Americanization programs among the Mexicans, besides raising their standard of living and their morals, would teach skills that would indirectly serve certain industries because Mexican girls, Ellis alleged, possessed a fondness for sewing, and because few of them entered high school. She concluded that their ability as seamstresses had to be developed in the elementary schools. Excuse me. Campbell Young's mental differences in certain immigrant groups pointed out that due to the assumed inability of the Mexican child to compete intellectually with the the curriculum of the Mexican schools had to accommodate the type of work available when these children entered the job market. Young proposed changes that would provide Mexicans with training for occupational efficiency, habits and attitudes as make for social cooperation, and finally training for appreciation of the arts and sciences for satisfaction and happiness. The importance of industrial education for Mexican children throughout the Southwest was also justified by intelligence tests, developed by scholars who argued that certain races were inherently more intelligent than others. In 1915, for example, Louis Terman at Stanford University observed that his tests showed that a low level of intelligence is very, very common among Spanish, Indian, and Mexican families of the Southwest, and also among Negroes. This dullness seems to be racial, or at least inherent in the family stocks from which they came. A few years later, another scholar writing in the Journal of Educational Psychology stated that in his opinion, Mexicans were mentally inferior to Anglo-Saxons, and that the factors contributing to their retardation included irregular school attendance, the transient character of the Mexican family, and the native capacity or intelligence of the Mexican people. Still others proposed that the Mexicans' problem in learning English indicated an inferior mental capacity. Indeed, B.F. Haught, in a 1931 article in the Journal of Applied Psychology, concluded that the command of English was the supreme indicator of intelligence. Teachers of Mexican children likewise alleged inferiority on the part of Mexicans. In 1929, a California teacher stated that Mexican children are usually of inferior intelligence in comparison with American children. According to him, Mexicans did not possess the intelligence to go beyond the third grade. Very few of these reports, however, mentioned language or poverty as a factor in the low scores achieved by Spanish-speaking children in tests, as well as in their poor performance in school. Nevertheless, by 1920, school boards and administrators used such measures to place Mexicans in slow learning classes and in vocational educational centers that produced manual laborers for employers. In his study, The Mexican Schools in the Los Angeles area, Gilbert Gonzalez notes that by the early 1930s, vocational training had to become the core curriculum of these institutions. Almonte, the district school superintendent, not only segregated Mexican children until their 13th birthday, but offered them special course offerings, including woodwork, domestic science, and other subjects that would help them take their place in society. The San Bernardino School District dealt with its Mexican problem, unquote, by establishing a segregated barrio school emphasizing vocational education. It was thought, Gonzalez writes, that this type of education would lead to habits of thrift and industry and to ability to make necessary contacts with the industrial world. Besides concentrating vocational education in East Side Mexican schools, Los Angeles schools closely cooperated with local industries in developing an efficient vocational program for Mexicans as well as other working class children. Businessmen expressed a natural interest in Los Angeles schools, stressed the manager of the Industrial Department of Chamber of Commerce in 1922. Sorry, glasses slipped. Not only because they helped pay the bills, but also because their workers came from the public schools, and hence their efficiency depended on the schools. Training methods as a result of efforts by Los Angeles garment manufacturers, the Chamber of Commerce, and the public schools, a cooperative trade school opened in the early 1920s that businessmen and educators hoped would meet the city's need for semi-skilled workers. The establishment of this trade school made it possible to train future workers, a task the factories found to be impossible. In addition to providing skills, the Mexican schools hoped to instill an acceptance of industry's hierarchical order. As one Los Angeles teacher put it, before sending the boys and girls out to accept positions, they must be taught that technically expert though they may be, they must keep in mind that their employers carry the responsibility of the business and outline the work, and that the employees must be pliant, obedient, courteous, and willing to help the enterprise. Their practice, Gonzalez writes, of Southern California school districts placed Mexican pupils into a course of study suited to their needs, which, of course, meant a non-academic curriculum, emphasizing manual training. For these children, their education was programmed to control their experiences rather than to enlarge their opportunity to change them. This form of education, devised by progressive educators, also affected other racial and cultural minorities in the United States by reinforcing class divisions in an industrial society. Besides the view that both Southwestern employers and the Mexican children could best be served by manual training, the schools stressed the need to instruct Mexicans in the ideals and ethics of American society. Complementing the progress of the Mexican schools in the county, the school superintendent of El Paso in 1913 stated that the first thing in Mexican children needed to learn was patriotism. El Paso schools claimed, however, that the Mexican family and culture hindered their attempt at socialization. For example, Principal Catherine Gorbut of Aoy believed that the Mexicans' lack of a sense of time increased school absenteeism. In years past, she recalled, there was the problem of getting children to school on time. Few homes had clocks, and the excuse for lateness on a cloudy day would be no hay sol y el sol y me relo. I hope I didn't mispronounce. There is no sun today, and the sun is my clock. So one can imagine how many would be tardy during dark mornings. As future urban wage workers, Mexican children needed to learn punctuality because time would indeed mean money. Yet Gorbet did not consider the innate or cultural characteristics of the Mexicans to be all bad. There are many things in which a Mexican excels, she stated in his sorry, in his painstaking capacity for little things, in his ability to make the best of a bad bargain, and in his philosophy that is why worry about what cannot be helped. The Mexicans are particularly gifted in art, work, and music. They make good athletes because they like to play. Oye School has won many trophies in sports. Most American teachers shared Gorbet's racial stereotypes and blamed the Mexican family for the perpetuation of ignorance and immorality. Mrs. F.W. Egan, a visiting teacher in El Paso in 1916, told the school board that an order which had closed the saloons and gambling halls in Ciudad Juarez had reduced, in her opinion, the number of Mexican truants from the schools. Before the saloons and gambling places had closed, said Mrs. Egan, many Mexican children from El Paso could be found on the other side under the influence of liquor. She also alleged frequently finding the children's mothers in the same establishments. In addition to drunkenness, some southwestern teachers believed that Mexican children found it more difficult to repress sexual urges than did Americans. Authorities on the Mexican mind agree. One Los Angeles school supervisor wrote in the 1920s that often the age of 12 to 14 causes educational and other higher ambition to turn to inclinations of sex impulse. Because the schools judged Mexicans to be culturally disadvantaged, officials developed great pride in their ability to Americanize them. It is impossible to estimate the general good that the school is doing and has done among these benighted Mexican people. The school report for 1903 to 2004 emphasized yearly there are 600 children who attend regularly this school. They come from the humblest homes where in past years a knowledge of English and habits of cleanliness and refinement were unknown. Among the first lessons instilled into these children when they enter the schoolroom is cleanliness. It is not uncommon sight here to see a kind-hearted school marm standing in the lavatory room by one of these home-neglected urchins and supervising the process of bringing about conditions of personal cleanliness as he applies with vigor to rusty hand, dirty ears and neck, unkempt face and head with the two powerful agencies of American civilization, soap and water. In addition to cleanliness and ethics, the schools considered the teaching of English to Mexican children a vital ingredient in the Americanization process. One school board member in 1903 praised American teachers at AOI for having accomplished wonders in teaching English to Mexican children and pointed out that because of the success, the language was increasingly spoken in Mexican families. As such, Mexican children acted as socializing agents within their families. To learn English, Mexican children had to remain segregated in the Mexican schools until they had been assimilated into public school work. Whereas almost all of the Mexican students knew no English when they entered school, they encountered instruction in English from the very start. Moreover, only a handful of Mexican teachers taught in the Mexican schools, and yet it does not appear that the Americans knew much Spanish. Yet even if they did, the schools did not encourage the use of Spanish in the classroom. What effect the cultural shock had on the Mexican children cannot be determined, but it may account for the lack of educational mobility among them. In a report on the public schools of El Paso in 1906, the superintendent of the state Department of Education supported the practice of hiring only teachers in the Mexican schools who did not know Spanish. According to the superintendent, many Mexicans who had learned English in the El Paso public schools had gone on to important positions in El Paso stores. Moreover, whenever the teachers did not know the pupils' language, the children had been forced to learn English. Quote, teachers who teach children of foreign parentage should not convey instructions in any other than the English language. The superintendent concluded, this is law and logic, calling for special English instruction for the Mexican child. Horn, in his 1922 survey, noted that the Mexicans' most essential need consisted of learning English, as well as Anglo-Saxon ideals and standards of living. Not only in El Paso, but throughout the Southwest, schools used English as a key socializing agent. In numerous articles on education and the Mexican population, scholars and teachers expressed much concern over language. Besides advocating English as fundamental to the learning process, they believed that if Spanish was retained over English, Mexican children would pose a future threat to the social order. The director of elementary education in San Antonio, for example, wrote in 1929 that the first step in making a unified nation is to teach English to the non-English speaking portions of the population. English, in addition to its ideological value, would also serve a practical economic function. It would make Mexicans better workers as the economy expanded, requiring a more trained and socialized labor force. According to one El Paso teacher, English was not too important for unskilled jobs, but it was for better positions, unquote. Both ideologically and economically, the teaching of English proved essential in fulfilling the goals of mass education. English was the common denominator between Mexican children and American teachers. At the same time, however, emphasized Spanish as a practical language for American students to learn owing to El Paso's border location. As early as 1882, the Lone Star advocate of a Spanish school in early El Paso would help Americans prepare for business careers in a bilingual community. For those Americans interested in becoming clerks, the newspapers believed a good knowledge of Spanish was equal to good letters of recommendations. In towns like El Paso, where so much commerce involved Mexicans, Americans needed to know Spanish. In order to improve business opportunities in Mexico. It is as little as the state school system should do for the youth of Texas. Editorialized the Times in 1889 that fit them to a large extent for such work by instructing them in Spanish. By 1913, the school board authorized the teaching of Spanish, but only in predominantly American schools and beginning in the 6th grade. The most pressing curricular need the superintendent of schools stressed was for Spanish instruction. Spanish for commercial reason, if no other, he told the school board should be taught in the grammar grades. Emphasizing the acquisition of a language was more easily accomplished during childhood. The head of the school system concluded that pure Castilian was not necessary. The language of the better classes of Mexicans would suffice. The need to use Spanish as a means to penetrate Mexican markets, as well as its significance to El Paso merchants, meant that the schools could not totally indict what they believed to be the progressiveness of Mexican culture. Moreover, the economic and political importance of the local Mexican population deterred such an attempt. Nevertheless, the schools left little doubt that the partial education of the Mexicans served a twofold purpose. It not only helped to meet El Paso's major labor needs, but through the Americanization process, it functioned as a form of social control over Mexican aliens, especially children, and helped direct their loyalties to the United States and to American principles. Boys and girls who then were half-dressed, half-fed wives. The school report of 1903 concluded, now speak English, hold positions as clerks in stores, bookkeepers, teachers, interpreters, do all kinds of work where intelligent labor is required. Dressmaking, laundering, cooking, housekeeping, blacksmithing, work in foundries, railroad shops, carpenter shop, factories, etc., and have become so Americanized that the influence they exert for good upon the city in point of sanitation. In manual labor, read that. Sorry about that. In manual labor, the American educator pointed out that in such subjects as spelling and arithmetic, the children of the Mexican schools compared favorably with the Americans. In Horn's opinion, El Paso had no choice but to continually stress the education and Americanization of its Mexican population. The future of the city of El Paso, he informed the school board, depends upon the prosperity and enlightenment of both its native-born citizens and its citizens of foreign birth. To underscore what successes had already been accomplished in the acceleration of the Mexican child, Horn terminated his report by quoting a letter he received in 1921 from Fidel Barron, a fifth grader at Aoy. I am very happy because you visited Aoy school, young Fidel wrote, and other schools of El Paso. I'm going to tell you the things that I like about the United States. The first thing that I am obliged for is education that the United States gives me. I like its libraries, the parks, and especially the swimming pools where in the summer one has a very happy time. Also, I like the scenery, the climate, the people, and the government. I hope you will come and visit our school again. Indeed, American teachers and in the Mexican schools took great pride in their work among the Mexicans. One principal even compared her facility to the missionaries. I considered the establishment of the school for the Mexican children of El Paso my greatest achievement, stated former student J.P. Putman in 1936. According to Putman, prior to his tenure as head of the El Paso schools, nothing had been done for the Mexicans who were growing up illiterate. Principal Gorbit of IE, at her retirement in 1941, concluded that seeing Mexican children grew up to be patriotic. Americans had been one of her major accomplishments, yet socializing success the Mexican schools had gained over the years would also bring forth a key contradiction embedded in the school systems, intended to turn out hardworking, and disciplined blue-collar workers. The Mexican schools, at the same time instilled egalitarian ideals and a success ethnic. The American dream, having accepted these principles, Mexicans, as they grew to maturity, began to demand their rightful place in American society and greater opportunities for economic and social mobility. Unlike their immigrant parents, a Mexican American generation by the 1930s saw themselves increasingly as Americans, but not as Mexicans, and questioned obstacles to full assimilation. Consequently, the Mexican schools, as the institutions that came to be most directly associated with the lack of economic opportunities, would in later years become one of the major battlegrounds in the Mexican Americans' quest for equality. Although Americanization programs to a large extent succeeded the schools in the Mexican district, from the very beginning faced many problems, particularly overcrowded conditions, due to the large number of Mexicans who attended the early grades. The greatest congestion, school superintendent in R. Crozier told the school board in 1912, exist in the Mexican schools. Horn also observed in his study that while all El Paso schools faced problems due to the city's rapidly expanding economy and population, the Mexican schools remained in worse shape. At Oy, for example, Horn discovered that no playground existed. In addition, the South Side schools had double the number of part-time classes that the American ones had. As a result, larger numbers of Mexican children could attend school only part of the day, while throughout much of the period Mexicans represented more than half of the total school enrollment. They also studied at fewer schools than the American children. The school census of 1908 reported that of 6,529 pupils in the El Paso public schools, 3,675 were Mexicans. In 1914, the number of Mexican students had doubled to 7,545 out of a total public school population of 11,863. 2 years later, the special 1916 census for El Paso revealed that out of school-aged children between 7 and 16, Mexicans constituted 63.1%. Mexicans attended as regularly as Americans, which only added to their overcrowded classrooms. Attendance at AOI, for example, in 1913, stood at 97%, while the average for all the schools came to a 95.5%. One contributing factor to the heavy enrollment in the South Side schools seemed to have been a little attitude of the Mexican parents. Although they themselves arrived with little or no education, many parents eventually supported schools as a way of helping their children acquire jobs in the United States or in Mexico. If the family ever returned, some parents, for example, wanted their daughters to learn enough English so they could get jobs as domestic in American neighborhoods. If Mexican parents had concerns over the effects of Americanization on native culture, they seem to have repressed them in the hope of material gains for their children. Furthermore, Mexican newspapers in El Paso published notices alerting to their readers to the opening dates of public schools and urging parents to enroll their children. Likewise, Mexican social organizations joined in this encouragement in a later part to a letter to the school, organizing organizings joined in this encouragement. In a letter to the school board in 1919, a group of Mexican clubs pledged their support to any effort to advance the cause of public education in the city. Some Mexicans were also advocated night schools for adults where certain skills as well as English could be learned. Grateful for the education, the Beale School provided Mexican children. One refugee wrote to the Herald in 1917, the progress that the children would make, the good discipline enforced, and the splendid professional spirit of the teachers appears doubly commendable on account of the fact, if I can turn the page, I'm sorry, that nearly all the children are Mexican children, and many of them refugees from Mexico, which such support Mexican attendance became concentrated, a largely in the racially segregated schools south of the tracks. The earliest schools in the area, Oya at 7th and Kansas, was the largest school in the city as well as the largest one for Spanish-speaking students in the United States. It multiplied from 200 pupils in 1897 to 1364 in 1919. Other schools heavily attended by Mexicans included the Alamo School at Hills and 4th and the Franklin School at the corner of West Overland and Leon. Faced with growing Mexicans enrollment in these two schools as the barrios expanded, American parents petitioned the school board in 1910 for permission to send their children to the predominantly white San Jacinto School. The board, I hate it when it does that. The board approved the recommendation, but rescinded it a few days later. Mexican parents protested what they believed to be a discriminatory act. As the Mexican settlement spread, however, American families moved to better neighborhoods in other sections of the city and left these houses to the Mexicans. It may be observed in passing, Horn pointed out in 1922 that while these races are not segregated by any order of the school board, they tend largely to segregate themselves on account of the districts in which the children reside. The public school at the smelter also contained mostly Mexicans, as did the Beale School in East El Paso, due to its location near the railroad yards at Piedras and Riviera. At the Beale School, there wasn't a single American nor black. Oh my gosh, this book is crazy. Okay. Have to fight with the book. Sorry, guys. School, there wasn't Americans or black. Ex-alumni Guillermo Balderas recalls everyone 100% at the Beale School was Mexican, including the Smelter School. These 5 Mexican schools in the El Paso district contained almost half the total school enrollment in 16 public schools during the 1919 through 1920 academic year. Besides overcrowding, the Mexican schools possessed only the early grades up to the 6th grade, with the exception of the Beale School, which had 8. The American neighborhoods, on the other hand, by 1920 contained 6 schools with 8 grades. Although a larger number of Mexican students could be found in the 7th and 8th grades. By 1922, Horn observed that whereas in the 1st grade, the children of the Mexican schools outnumbered those in the American ones by almost 3 to 1, the exact reverse held true for the 7th graders, with few students able to encouraged to go beyond the 5th or 6th grade. Educational mobility for the Mexicans was quite limited. High school figures show that between 1898 and 1920, only 22 Spanish surnamed students graduated from the El Paso High School compared to 812 Americans, and not until 1927 was a Mexican high school, Bowie, available in the barrios. What was the use of a Mexican going to high school? A camera? Carlos remembered of those years, whom he couldn't get a decent job. Balders. Let me try doing this. This book just doesn't want to work with me, guys. Okay. All right. Balders recalls that upon finishing the 6th grade in 1922, one of his teachers told the class they should not plan on going to high school because Mexican workers only as laborers. You are people here to dig dishes. The longtime El Paso resident remembers the teacher's words to do pick and shovel work. I don't think any of you should plan to go to high school. The educational programs of the Catholic Church did not substantially improve the economic opportunities of most American Mexicans, and the role of the church will be examined more thoroughly in a later chapter. The complete records of the early parochial schools in the south side no longer exist, but what remains reveals that the schools were limited enrollments throughout the period in comparison to the public schools. Moreover, it appears that parochial school students came from slightly better off Mexican families, many of them political refugees, who could afford the tuition charged by the schools, which in the case of Sacred Heart amounted to 50 cents a month per child. 1907, the Sacred Heart on South Oregon Street had 300 Mexicans, but by 1920 that had declined to a little over 200. St. Ignatius on the Park contained 650 Mexican students in 1917 and represented the largest parochial school in El Paso. A 3rd grade school, Guardian Angel, opened by 1920 to service the Mexicans in East El Paso. The few Mexicans also attended the predominantly American St. Mary's School in the central high part of the city. Of the Mexican parochial schools, Sacred Heart and St. Ignatius had the full 8th grades. Although these efforts by the church meant that an additional number of Mexicans could attend schools, they did not alter, in general, the educational discrimination and racial segregation that was aimed at Mexican children in El Paso, and that reinforced a lower economic advancement of the Mexican working class. Clearly, Mexicans have not had a history of educational neglect, but a history of limited schooling, which in turn supported the desire of Southwestern employees for menial, cheap, and menial labor. Here's some pictures of 1883. And here's the railroad system that came. Mexican refugees entering El Paso in 1914. Mexican refugees at Fort Bliss. Another tents. Mexican laborers at the Southwest Portland Cement. Cigar makers at the Coburg. Lots of pictures. Sorry. Picture. And that is the end of chapter 6. Thank you.